I am super excited to introduce Sonal Jessel. So Sonal is the Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice, which is based in New York. She's responsible for advancing We Act's policy agenda at the local, state, and national levels and leads their New York City policy initiatives and their Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan. A lot of her interests are focused on the intersection of environmental and social justice, health, and policy. And in addition to her public health background, she and I both share a background in biology. With that, Andre, if you could stop sharing, we'll turn over the slide control to Sonal.
Great, thank you so much, Swati, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm happy to be here with you all. Let me just pull up my screen. So I am going to do a brief overview of the work that we've done in the past 2 years, really, but it's been very notable in the past 6 months or so on the topic of cumulative impacts, how we as an organization with our partners got to the place we are at now, what we've learned from the process, and really ultimately what we want to see in a duplicated efforts across the United States to address a legacy environmental justice issue. So just to begin, We Act for Environmental Justice. We are a community-based organization in West Harlem in New York City. We have been an organization since 1988. We started through a protest of this sewage treatment plant, which is pictured here, being placed in the west side of Harlem, which is on the waterfront, if you're not familiar with New York City. And this sewage treatment plant was actually meant to be placed downtown in the neighborhood of, I believe, Chelsea in New York City, which is a wealthier and at that time and still true, a neighborhood that is not predominantly people of color. And even though that was engineering wise, the correct place to put this treatment plant due to the flow of the river that it was going on, it was placed up on the west side of Harlem. It was considered an act of environmental racism because it was community, a predominantly Black and African-American community in this area that did not have the same level of sort of power to stop the placement of a polluting facility in their neighborhood. And so We Act was born out of this fight against this treatment facility. We won a lawsuit to cap the emissions of the facility and actually put a park on top of it. So now on top of the sewage treatment facility is Riverbank State Park, which is apparently the #1 populated, most visited park in all of New York State. And it's a great big park. But the sewage treatment plant, even to this day, still has issues, and we get reports all the time that it emits smelly, toxic fumes. So what we were addressing in the sewage treatment plant and now has become the central focus of our organization is achieving environmental justice, which, just to set some definitions, environmental justice in a nutshell is the idea that everyone deserves to live, work, play, pray, learn in a healthy environment. And that should be a right to everyone, regardless of your race, your class, your gender, your caste. However, what we have is environmental racism, in which there is discrimination systematically, institutionally, and interpersonally in terms of who is exposed to environmental hazards more and who benefits from environmental benefits more. And we see that racism coming out. Particularly, we focus on the policy side of it, in which there's a lot of different laws that have led to communities of color to sort of bear the burden of toxic polluting facilities or other sources of environmental hazards throughout generations. So now this is my little graphic to describe how matters have just gotten worse, and we have extra new concerns that are changing the game and making the work for environmental justice and the movement for environmental justice that much more dire. our traditional model is environmental racism hurts health of people, and we see that all the time. The most classic example is a polluting facility in a neighborhood makes air pollution bad in a neighborhood, and therefore you get asthma, and asthma is bad and hurts your health. But what we're seeing more, and we're working in an emerging way, is climate change, which of course is a dire issue and a big threat to public health. But climate change is also disproportionately burdening frontline communities, communities of color, communities of low income across the US and the world. And now we have the additional COVID-19 pandemic, which is still affecting communities in different ways and has really changed the landscape of what kind of work you can get done, how you organize with communities, what resources are available to people. And, we're seeing a lot of downstream impacts of the pandemic, of course, in a more really scary way. In New York City, for example, really big rent increases is something we're grappling with a lot. So one area that we work in, and this is kind of getting us into the cumulative impacts conversation, is land use and sustainability. So the environmental justice movement, one of the key issues that started the movement in a more formal way is the idea that communities of color are more exposed to toxic pollution, whether that be in their products, waterways, or notably when it comes to land use, so facilities being placed in neighboring communities and then poisoning the air or the water. And so WEACT has always worked on this issue of land use and equitable land use and sustainability work. Notably, we helped develop the West Harlem Piers Park, which is a big park on the side of West Harlem, right on the waterfront, where you can see this picture is now where a big green park is. And that was important to not only create a space for community members to go in a neighborhood that hasn't received as much investments in park and green space historically, but also it is a place that helps with flooding. It helps reduce heat impacts. It cleans our air, all of the things that are good from vegetation in parks. And now we're working on another project around East Harlem. The east side of Harlem deals with a lot of intersecting issues, extreme heat, flooding. It's a very low income community. It is a community filled with a lot of people that are monolingual Spanish speakers. It's filled with, actually, it is a place where the homelessness crisis really comes to a head in New York City for a lot of different reasons. And so this is a neighborhood that needs a lot of investment in order to revitalize the neighborhood and make sure that we are ensuring that all of the gentrification and development that's coming to East Harlem right now is sort of happening in a way where we're investing in the people that already live there, growing local businesses, making sure people have a right to affordable housing, making sure we don't see gentrification in the way we have in other parts of New York City. So it's another type of land use work that we are doing. But the big piece in land use that we have been working on is changing policy, not just working on one-off different projects. What we ultimately want to see is the stopping of disproportionate siting of toxic facilities in communities of low income and communities of color, also referred to as environmental justice communities. Dr. Bob Bullard, who is considered one of the founders of the environmental justice movement in the United States, he came out with a seminal report that some of you may know. It's called Toxic Waste and Race. It came out in the 80s, and it basically proved that particularly Black communities are dealing with the brunt of toxic contamination due to siting of facilities. And he did a report about 20 years later, finding that that problem has not changed. It's the same issue, and no one has really taken steps to systemically change the way that facilities are sited in communities of color and low income across the United States. And so that is what we've started to focus on addressing as an organization nationally and both in New York State. So we're talking about cumulative impacts. This is a terminology that has started to be used a lot more often, and it really refers to the idea that when you combine environmental hazard that's where you see a health impact, or that's where you see a public health impact that is a concern for that area. So we're talking about multiple facilities being put in a neighborhood, and that's where you see a toxic soup of pollution that hurts the population there, versus looking at one facility at a time as an individual polluter. And when we're talking about cumulative impacts, it's not just necessarily facilities, but it could be any kind of form of environmental or public health hazard. So it could be a combination of toxic facilities with diesel buses driving through a neighborhood, for example. So that is the accumulation of toxic hazards leading to what we are concerned about, which is our health and well-being. So this is just a visual of 5 facilities that are located within about a 20-block radius in northern Manhattan, which is the area that we focus in as an organization, and all of them are polluting facilities. And so you can imagine if one of them is in the neighborhood, it might be okay. The air pollution impacts might not be too bad. It might not lead to as many asthma, cardiovascular disease, hospitalizations, ER visits, or chronic illness. However, when you put them all together, you've got a lot of air pollution in one community. So this is a picture that just kind of shows where they are within Washington Heights and Inwood, which is the very tip of northern Manhattan. And what I also didn't put in the pictures is that there are 2 major highways that go through these neighborhoods as well. So you have actually 3. So you have a huge source of air pollution in one small concentrated area, and that's that cumulative impact. So for the past 2 years, we have been working on how do we address this problem? How do we stop this legacy of disproportionate siting? And so we have championed with a lot of partners a legislation in New York State that we call the Cumulative Impacts legislation. And essentially what it does is it requires anyone seeking to permit a facility, they have to prove that they're not contributing to cumulative impacts in a neighborhood where they want to site their facility. And if they are contributing to that already existing environmental or public health burden in a neighborhood, then they can get their permit denied. What is so exciting about this legislation is that it's finally saying, we're not just concerned about one individual facility and doing an environmental review for one individual facility, which might not show so much pollution. But if you want to put your facility somewhere, you have to take into account all of the already existing pollution burdens in that area and add that to your calculation around what's your impact. And this is what is so exciting about the legislation, because it is really going to effectively stop allowing polluting facilities in the communities that we work in, because they already are disproportionately burdened, and we know that from so many studies. And so this legislation, it was sponsored by 2 legislators that represent areas that do deal with a lot of pollution. And we were able to get the legislation passed in the state legislature just in April, which was really exciting after a lot of work throughout the year and the year before advocating for the legislation, going back and forth with the state on language that's okay, and doing a lot of public work and public pressure work to move this forward. So we published a lot of op-eds, we did a lot of press conferences, talked to legislators constantly, held rallies, and really did a lot of that kind of work to push the legislation forward. And ultimately, we were successful, and we are in the stage now where we are trying to get the bill signed by our governor, because it does need to be signed actively into law for it to become law in New York State. So this is our long-term game, is we want this kind of legislation to pass nationwide. WEACT convenes what's called the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum. It is a group of 50+ environmental justice organizations across the United States that are all working together and being aligned on our ultimate sort of goals for policy work across the areas that we all represent. And one of our biggest focuses is across the whole United States, how do we enact these kinds of legislations that undoes and really focuses on stopping this environmentally racist siting of facilities in communities of color and low income across the United States, because this is an issue that doesn't just impact in New York City and New York, but it's all over in the South and the West, all over the United States. This is chronically the same pattern repeating itself across so many jurisdictions where these facilities are put in lower income communities. And so we work with this forum to really think about which states can pass this legislation, which states should be first, what are the lessons learned from each other, how do we make this a reality across the United States. One thing that really enabled us to be successful in New York State was that New Jersey passed this legislation in 2020, right before us. They were the first state to do it, and it was hailed as the holy grail of environmental justice legislation. And we were so thankful that New Jersey was able to pass this law as led by the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance and Ironbound and their partners, because it really did open the door for New York State to do the same. We had we already had something codified somewhere that we could use to justify the fact that this can be done in New York State. And we really did pit New York State and New Jersey's rivalry against each other to make it happen. And so this was how we were successful in New York State is that we really did take lessons learned from New Jersey. We learned what provisions were not going to happen no matter how hard they tried. We learned what were the right facilities to be focusing on, how to target the most polluting facilities, what we need to make sure is included in there in strong language. How do we make sure that permits can actually be denied based off of these provisions? Those were all things that we got from the New Jersey legislation, and it's really helped guide us. And it's also helped the decision makers and the agencies in New York State be warmer to such a big deal of a change in the way that they do their permit renewals and citing processes, because New Jersey has 30 pages of a ruling about how to do this work. And so now New York State can take that document and apply it to New York, and their work is a little bit easier. So it's been really important that we are collaborating across states to get this legislation done. And it's something we think is really viable across a number of states in the United States now. So our next steps are that we need to get the legislation signed by the governor. So we've been doing a lot of public work. We held a webinar a couple of weeks ago with some of the leaders in the environmental justice movement, talking about the importance of this kind of law, talking about what this will do for the long-term well-being of environmental justice communities, and really trying to pressure our governor and make it clear to her that this bill is not something to veto or to let go, because we are not surprised that there is opposition. There are a lot of private companies or municipalities that don't want to have to do this work. It is extra work to find out if you are contributing to an existing burden. You have to do those reports. And they, of course, don't want to be doing that and do want to continue to cite in low-income communities and use environmental justice communities as their dumping grounds. And so we are not surprised, but we do have opposition, and that is a part of what we're working on now, is how do we really push back against that and make a clear case for how important it is to reduce pollution burden in these communities. So this is just a shout out to lots of partners. We also could not have achieved this legislation win if we didn't have so many coalition partners. We have folks that are legal experts and could give us a lot of information about how the permitting process actually works, because it's very confusing. We had a lot of groups that have constituencies across the state We Act is membership based in Manhattan and New York City. And so we needed people outside of New York City to also be supporting this, because New York State is actually quite huge. And there are a lot of different people that you have to take into account. And so with this big partnership, we were able to move the bill forward. And with that, I will end, and happy to take questions and comments. And if anyone wants to be actively involved in helping us achieve this goal in New York State, whether it be with research or advocacy or anything, you can always get in touch with me. And then we're also happy to always be available as to help lead other states to do this work as well. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Sonal. That was amazing. And definitely, folks, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or go ahead and raise your hand. That's totally fine, and I can call on you. So I'll just give people a few seconds. I had like a first initial question, Sonal, which I was kind of wondering, what were the provisions that were like an absolute no in the legislation in New Jersey, for example?
Oh, so the biggest difficult piece was being able to deny renewal permits. So the New Jersey legislation really focuses on new permits. So a facility that hasn't yet been built or hasn't yet been put somewhere, you know, what's their impact, and if they have an impact, then find somewhere else to go, or reduce your emissions and pollution. But what the New Jersey legislation couldn't get done was that type of provision for existing facilities in some way. So, you know, there are a lot of really, really, really polluting facilities that currently exist.
Right.
And was there some way to incorporate reducing their pollution as part of the legislation? That would have been something that was unfortunately not something New Jersey could do. They do have some language in there for renewal permits around, like there does need to be some active work to reduce, to like mitigate pollution, but it's not really strong or specific. And so in general, their bill really does focus on new permits. Ours right now does include permit renewals, and we're excited to see how much of that we can end up keeping into the legislation.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious about that, considering the opposition that you were saying you faced, and that, you know, definitely renewing permits for existing polluters is going to be, yeah, it's going to be a tough hill.
Exactly. We know there's going to be a middle ground. I mean, we can't tell New York City they can't have any sewage treatment facilities, unfortunately, but maybe they can stop them being so polluting, at least in the process.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I actually, could you talk a little bit more about what kind of data requirements are in the process by which you identify impacts? Is it in the bill, or is it part of an administrative process?
Yeah, it would be a little bit more part of an administrative process, like part of, so New York State already has a permitting process, an environmental quality review process, that permit seekers are already required to fill out a lot of information. The addition here is that they have to make some type of calculation of how they're contributing to a burden that already exists. So they have to use information from, I guess there's no rule of like where they get their information from, but it has to be a trusted site, you know, from the government, like air monitoring, that they have to kind of take that information and add it to their calculations. That's a little bit different. But for New York State, we actually have a lot of that information already. So we don't believe that is a huge added burden. What we're hearing is that monitoring facilities for their pollution or doing modeling on that is the bigger burden that they're worried about.
So there's not an actual data requirement in the bill, but just like they can use existing data that they identify. I'm just curious if there's data requirements per se, or it's just more flexible?
No, it is, well, so it does outline the type, it does outline what, generally what data points you have to include in the report.
Mhm.
It doesn't specify where that information needs to come from or anything like that. That would happen more in the ruling. So they would submit their reporting to the state, and then the state would pretty much like go through it and question
see.
them on everything. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Mhm.
Awesome. Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah, Lee, I think I saw your hand first, and then Marcel.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you know of other states that are going down this path related to cumulative impacts, or if there is, I don't know, a website or somewhere where we could find that information.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's not other states doing this like as close to what New York and New Jersey have done. There are some states exploring this, and some states that have kind of pieces of this legislation already done. Like California, for example, does include in their permitting processes some good language around the need to mitigate pollution in facilities, things like that, but they don't have a legislation like this overarchingly, but it is a state that's thinking of doing this work. I think Maine is looking at it, Massachusetts, and then there's another West Coast state. It might be Washington, but I'll double check on that. I don't think that there is a centralized space that has this information just written somewhere. There is a couple groups that are working on it nationally as well. I can see if I can find their website and see if it says it on there.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I've just been so surprised in Michigan where like anytime there's a request to increase emissions, it is only looked at from that one source, and it doesn't matter what else is going on around it. And it just seems like crazy policy. So,
yeah, it seems obvious.
Yeah, it really is like, so anyways, your work is really amazing, and congratulations on the success that you've had.
Thank you. We do have, there are a lot of really strong environmental justice partners in Michigan that I haven't talked to them specifically about this, but I do imagine they are likely exploring this legislation as well.
Awesome. Maricel?
Hi, thank you. And a second, congratulations. This is a big deal. I was wondering, I think it's follow up on what Tracy was asking about data. In the language that you shared in your slides from S8830, that says requires agencies to prepare an existing burdens report. If you can clarify what that means, what are the agencies? And how are those in charge of the community and looking at the community, or is also a synonym for the facilities that are trying to get a new permit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of this isn't fully figured out yet, I'll say. But how it reads right now is that the department that is the lead of doing environmental impact statements or reviewing these impact statements, which already exist, is the state's Department of Environmental Conservation. And so they're in this legislation, they're essentially given authority to either create this sort of additional cumulative burden reporting for a facility, or they're able to require that facility to create that report. Likely they would require the facility to do it instead of take on that work themselves. And so that's how it would happen. They would sort of review the permit, say, oh, your permit is in an environmental justice community, you need to do a cumulative burden report, which is this report that's written in the language there. Go off and do it, and then they bring it back to the state DEC, which then makes a ruling on it. There is a different piece of the provision in this legislation that I didn't explicitly write in, where it actually does apply to other agencies or municipalities as well. So the Department of Transportation is a good example. A highway, for example, they might have to be doing a report if they want to put a bus yard somewhere, things like that. So that would run through a different agency than the Department of Environmental Conservation, but it is mostly the DEC that would make these rulings and review the reports.
Thank you.
Awesome. Are there any other questions for Sonal?
Yeah, I just had want to follow up on the state legislation. Have you guys thought about this as, I mean, obviously you can look at it and figure out which pieces work and don't work, but creating, some people create these model legislations that they shop around to other states. Do you have, is that part of your, what was the name of, sorry, I missed the Alliance?
Environmental Justice Leadership Forum. Yeah. So, I mean, essentially we give the legislation over to anyone, and it kind of is the model legislation. The difference is New York State has, like, if you know what NEPA is, we have a sort of mini NEPA process that other states don't have. So we have a little bit more of a complicated permit process. If we were giving this legislation to another state, we'd probably take all of that out and simplify it before handing it over. But I mean, essentially, yes, we do shop it around in that way. Because it's in the process of getting finished, and we think there will be changes to this legislation, we're not really handing it over to anyone right now until we finish all of those negotiations and get the bill signed into law.
Thanks.
All right, folks, if we don't have any additional questions for Sonal, I just want to say thank you so much for the amazing amount of work that this has taken that I'm sure you didn't even get into scratching the surface of in this presentation. But it's really, really important, and I'm so happy to see it. And, I really hope we're able to use this to make change, nationwide.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.